Hello guys, and welcome to a new Steel Division video today by me, Vulcan. Today I have for you the updated battle group overview for the Guards Armoured Division. So as usual, I'll be going through the changes that I've made to the division since my last battle group overview video, and I'll also be talking through some of the balance changes that have occurred since then as well. So let's start off with the Recon. Now in the Recon tab, there is a little bit to talk about. The main thing that has changed though on my end is I've removed the AEC Mark IIIs from my division. Personally, I don't really find that they are worth their cost in most cases. They cost 125 points, and the main thing that lets them down is just their lack of veterancy. I reckon if the AEC Mark IIIs had veterancy, you'd be in a much better position throughout the game. But spending 125 points on a recon vehicle in Phase A just isn't great, especially when you compare like the AEC Mark III, for example, to the Command Cromwell 7, which is 11 AP and 7 armor for 120 points. It's a command star on it. Well, it's a command tank, and it has an experience on it as well, and it's faster off-road than this vehicle. And just for the extra recon, it's not worth it in any case. So yeah, I leave the AECs out of the division these days. I think they could do with a nice price reduction or something, just to buff them up a little bit. But either way, let's move on. In Phase A, I'm taking the Scouts, the 40-point Scouts in the Universal Carrier. Now these are pretty expensive recon to be bringing in early on. Like, you can get 30-point recon with the Recce, but I really do prefer having the 5-man Scout squads, just because they are much more resilient to fire. So if they get caught out, you know, they get spotted somewhere, they have a chance to run away before dying. Whereas Recce, they just generally seem to just die instantly. Also, I much prefer using the Universal Carrier over the Willys MMG, just because the Universal Carrier has that little bit of armor, which is really helpful and allows it to support infantry way more effectively. So after you've dropped off your scouts, you can use that Universal Carrier offensively with other infantry. As for the Recce, I brought those in the Humber Mark III. This Humber Mark III can actually be pretty useful in Phase A. It does have a solid 16 HE against infantry at 16 or 600 meter range. So as sort of fire support, the Humber Mark III is great, and with the reintroduction of the armor piercing value, it's actually decent for taking out half tracks as well. So that's what I'd mainly use the Humber Mark III for. So if I'm kind of struggling with my infantry, and it's because of a lot of half tracks, then instead of investing in like a tank, which is going to cost me over 100 points, I would much rather invest in like a Humber Mark III with a recon squad. And you get that recon squad basically to come in with it. Now the other choices, of course, are the Humber Mark IV, but this is a 7 round per minute rate of fire, 4 accuracy AP gun. With like that 7 AP, just not very good for 75 points. I think these are still a bit overpriced, but what I do have in Phase B is the Recce with the MMG carrier. And this MMG carrier is fantastic. It has the Bren gun in the hull, and then it has a mounted Vickers machine gun, which gives it a total of 12 HE at 600 meter range, which is very, very good for demolishing infantry squads. So aside from having more availability of recon in the later phases, you also have the MMG carrier to directly support your infantry. So that is the reason I bring those in. So let's move on to the infantry tab. Now the infantry tab was changed about quite a bit. They definitely changed a lot. And it's kind of hard to explain every little change that happened, but basically they introduced motorized rifles into Phase A, and it's really helped out quite a lot with their sort of staying power in Phase A, because they now have Piats on their infantry, which is very, very nice. Like AT on just your standard infantry squads is great. That's why Panzer Grenadiers are so versatile. And motorized rifles, although they don't necessarily hold up to the best of the infantry, they still can hold the line, and with that Piat they are a threat to enemy vehicles quite nicely. So that stops them getting charged down by things like half tracks and other vehicles. So in Phase A I am taking the one card of rifles available Then I've got one card of the Motorized Rifle Leader, just because it's important that you do bring in Command Infantry in Phase A. And then I have the 2 cards of the Motorized Rifles available. Vickers HMGs, they're too short range to be valued in Phase A, or any phase for that matter. They have less HE, less range than an MG, and just aren't really worth the cost in Phase A, especially when you can get the Motorized Rifle with the M5 half-track, which has the 30 cal on it in an armoured vehicle. So that's just where you're going to get your machine gun from anyway. As for the Bren Group are incredibly cheap. They were definitely buffed. They had their points cost reduced from 15 to 10. And now that makes them a very cheap unit to bring in these half-tracks. So I wouldn't be surprised if people choose to use them. But in general, to me, you need to get as much quality in Phase A as you can, taking up as many slots as you can. So, like if I swapped out the Motorized Rifles for the Bren Group, I feel like I would just lack quality. That's what I'm trying to get at for the same availability. Then in Phase B, well, I'm going to be just spamming out the rifles, as I do have 2 cards of these rifles here, 8 in each. That gives you 16 rifles to play with, plenty of infantry to support your front against enemy infantry, whilst your tanks and fire support do the damage. And you can get a lot of Vickers HMGs and the Bren Group again in the M5 half-tracks. You can also get Assault Pioneers, which are pretty decent for like the close quarters combat, and furthermore you can get more Motorized Rifles. However, I feel like just the pure availability of having 16 rifle squads is more than enough to do all of the jobs of the Vickers HMG, the Bren Group, and the Assault Pioneers. Like, these guys are 10-man squads, and they don't go away that easy, that's for sure. Keep a command nearby, and you will be absolutely fine. Motorized Rifles, it might be worth bringing in an extra card of those in Phase B if you are struggling with not having enough AT on your infantry. But generally, I think this availability is just too good to pass up. Furthermore, the other option that you could possibly bring is the Assault Pioneers for the close quarters combat, but I tend to avoid that like the plague with the Guards Armoured. As for the Phase C, well, you can get 8 Motorized Rifles in Phase C, and this is just a really nice boost. The best thing about it is they come with the extra experience. So you get like 2-star half-tracks and 2-star Motorized Rifles if you have them with a command. And it's really, really strong for the late game to just solidify your position when you might be struggling against late game armor like Panthers and King Tigers. So that's your lot for the infantry. In the tank tab's changed an absolute ton. They've reduced the price on the Shermans in this division quite substantially. The Sherman 5 command was reduced from 150 points to 135 points, which is a 15-point price buff. And the Sherman 4 was reduced from 140 points to 130 points. So using these Shermans is actually a lot more common in the Guards Armoured, when before you used to see basically only Fireflies being used. But in Phase A, the Stuart price was also reduced as well, so 90 to 80, and these Stuarts are well worth bringing in now, in my opinion. They are just fantastic for pinning down infantry very quickly. They have the 8 AP to challenge most light armor and also just generally vehicles. So just nice fire support for your infantry early on. And I have them accompanied by a Command Cromwell 4, which is 11 AP and 7 front armor for 120 points. Now, if you compare the Command Cromwell to the other Cromwells you can get in Phase A, well, this Cromwell's pretty decent with the 11 front armor, but if you compare it to the Cromwell 5s, well, it's basically the same tank, except from you get the command and the inherent experience. So the only change that I would possibly suggest is swapping out the Command Cromwell 4 for the command, or for the just normal Cromwell 7, which has that extra front armor, which does make it a lot harder to kill. But generally, I find the Command Cromwell does the job quite nicely. So moving into Phase B, I do have the card of the Cromwell 7s, just because for 120 points, they're an absolute steal. I believe they were reduced in price previously, and it just makes them well worth having for sure. 11 front armor, like 11 AP. If you compare that, that's exactly the same as a Sherman 5. It's just cheaper. Now obviously the Sherman 5 comes with a 50 cal, which does help it out a lot with its ranged engagements versus infantry, but the Cromwell 7 still has 2 Besa machine guns with 8 HE, so it's definitely still going to do a lot of damage to infantry if they get in range of those machine guns, so still provides that decent amount of fire support. But aside from that anyway, I do have some of the Sherman 5s, the Command Sherman 5s. I don't need necessarily a ton of availability in Phase B because you are limited by your income. So the Sherman 5s here, these Command Sherman 5s, just are there to provide extra command, not only for my tanks but for other units as well, and come in very handy throughout the game. I don't bring in the standard Sherman 5 cards because they don't have the inherent experience. So it works out quite nicely just bringing in the command units of the Sherman 5s because they come with the 1-star experience and they have the command ability. Now we also have the option to bring in the Fireflies, so I am going to be bringing in 2 Fireflies in Phase B without veterancy and the one that you can get with veterancy. You used to be able to get 2 cards of Fireflies with experience, but now you can't, so you're going to have to deal with one. And it's definitely worth having, and that's probably the most important tank to have in this division. So moving on to Phase C, we have the Sherman 5s again, the command variants. No point in taking the normal Sherman 5s without the veterancy. Yes, they would have 1-star the same as the command Sherman 5s if they have a command nearby, but these Sherman 5s provide their own command, which definitely accompanies the Fireflies very well, which do definitely need that extra experience buff. So there you're going to be finding that they work well together. And yeah, Fireflies, Sherman 5s, late game is going to be your main setup to deal with things like Panthers that will definitely be threatening you. And that's where the 2-star Firefly comes in handy in Phase B for taking on things like Panther Ds, which will definitely be thrown out at you by divisions like the 12th SS Panzer. So let's move on to the support. In the support tab, I do have dingoes available, and these dingoes just sort of supplement command in Phase A and for the later phases as well, when you don't necessarily have enough points to bring in a Sherman 5, but you still want that command for sure to accompany something like an AT gun or maybe one of these Cromwell 6s, for example. And that's the other thing that we're bringing in Phase A. Cromwell 6s in Phase A, very, very important. These are the staple fire support units for your infantry and allow your tanks to also push early in Phase A. Keeps the Stuarts and the Cromwells alive versus 1,000 meter range AT guns. AT guns with 1,200 meter range at the start of the game, you may have a little bit of trouble dealing with, like the Pack 40s, like they can just pop these Cromwells very quickly. So be careful, look out for them. If you spot one, reverse out of range, do the fire position trick, or you can just bring in like a Spitfire bomber, or you can bring in like an artillery piece like the Sexton or the 120 pounders. But generally, you should be aware of what sort of AT you're going to be coming up against before the game starts. So depending on the division you're up against, you should try and know that they have a Pack 40. It's just something that you've got to learn, and then you can play around that and bring in maybe a Sexton from the start or a 120 or 25 pounder from the start in order to take care of that. But either way, Bedford Supply is waiting till Phase B to be brought in. I dropped the sods from the division. I had enough trying to get these to kill a King Tiger. My dream was that one day I would smoke a King Tiger, I could sneak a sod into the smoke, and then destroy a King Tiger with a Piat. That was my dream, but it never really came to fruition. So I kind of gave up on the sods and I removed them from my division. I never really needed the extra command anyway. So the Bedford Supply is my supply for the entire game, which is generally more than enough. And then I have the Cromwell 6s in Phase B as well for more 13 HE power, 1200 meter range, fire support. Crocodiles, too expensive, don't really do the job in the late game. They're pretty decent early on in Phase A and Phase B sometimes, but Phase C is just one step too far for the Cromwell. Let's move on to the anti-tank. So the anti-tank's pretty simple. There hasn't really been too much changed in terms of the anti-tank. You can get Piat squads in the MMG carriers, which is tempting, but I just rely on having 6-pounders in Phase A. I've got basically 6 17-pounders in Phase B, and that's your lot. As for the other choices, you can get Piats in Phase B in the M5 half-tracks, which is okay. And you can also get Achilles in Phase C. But the thing is about the Achilles, yes, they come with the extra veterancy, but they have less armor than like something like a Firefly. And in my opinion, I'd always have a Firefly over an Achilles any day. So having these in my division just felt like an absolute waste of an activation point, so I just don't use them anymore at all. Let's move on to the anti-air tab. So the anti-air is pretty standard, very similar to the way I had it before. 2 of the Crusader AA Mark IIs in Phase A and 4 of the Crusader AA Mark IIs in Phase B. But dropping the sods in the support tab allowed me to pick up a card of Crusader AA Mark Is in Phase C, which are just really good mobile fire support and anti-air to accompany your tanks in late game. Early on, bringing in Crusader AA Mark IIs will definitely do the job against aircraft, but if for example these start to get picked off and you need something with a bit more punching power, the Crusader AA Mark I will definitely provide that 10 HE fire, which will definitely prevent bombing strikes from coming in on your tanks, which will be really nice and help you out a lot. So yeah, just added a bit more availability there to my anti-air. These Polstons in Phase A, maybe they could be used as fire support in certain situations, but don't really find a activation point on the division to use them. So let's move on to the artillery tab. Now the artillery tab, again, is pretty barren. There's a lot of sort of sections of the Guards Armoured that don't really have that many choices, and I think there's like pretty obvious decisions to be made in a lot of cases for the Guards Armoured. But here we have the artillery tab, which is basically the same again. I have the Sextons in Phase B and Phase A. So in Phase A you can get 2 Sextons. I've got 1 of them coming in. And then in Phase B you can get 2 cards of 2 Sextons, and I've got both of those coming in. Now the reason I'm preferring Sextons over 25-pounders is just because Sextons are so much harder to kill by counter battery. So at the moment artillery is definitely prevalent in Steel Division because of the introduction of the DLC divisions. So bringing in 25-pounders often meant that you get counter-artied, and people would bring in something to deal with your 25-pounders. People bring in bombing strikes, they bring in rocket strikes, and 25-pounders are very vulnerable to those. Whereas Sextons aren't so much because they're an armoured vehicle. Yes, they can still be bombed, yes, they can still be rocketed, but it's a lot less likely to kill them, and they're much easier to reposition should they get spotted. So I just find Sextons in general, the extra cost is well worth it for the survivability of the unit. In Phase A it can sting to have to bring in a Sexton to deal with like a 1200 meter range AT gun, for example, but at the end of the day it will be worth it for the rest of the game, because you will have that there basically for the entire game, unless you get pushed in really hard and somebody, you know, direct hits it with a tank or something. You will be doing okay with those Sextons. They can definitely keep themselves hidden very easily if you use them correctly. The 2-inch carriers in Phase A, waste of time. 700 meter range, 4 HE power mortar. They do have the 4 HE power on the Bren gun. If you were going to ever use these, make sure that the machine guns on range are like in line of sight, whilst you're firing at stuff with the mortar, otherwise you just won't do any damage. 3-inch mortars in Phase B, not worth it compared to Sextons ever. And off map, this would be something that I would consider if I had an extra activation slot. And I guess you could probably find an extra activation slot from the tank tab in order to bring in a Sherman 5 OP, because the great thing about off map is it can force units from behind cover to fall back, and that's just fantastic for allowing you to like charge them with Shermans at close range and pop certain tanks. But the 25-pounders tend to do that job as well, in the Sextons that is. So you can use those for the same thing. Now moving on to the air tab. The air tab's pretty lackluster. In Phase A you can get Ulsters, you can get Tempests, or you can get Spitfire bombers. in phase I am taking a Spitfire bomber. You only have 3 activation points to work with, or activation slots. So a Spitfire bomber is going to be taking up my first slot. And quite simply to quickly get rid of anything that I'm having trouble dealing with. So in phase A, if there's like a certain unit or an AT gun that's definitely doing a lot of damage to my units, I can just bring this in, drop 2 15 HE power bombs on it, and hopefully it will be dealt with. As for the other units, I don't think Tempests in phase I are very much worth it, because you do have Crusader AAs to work with. Like the Crusader AA Mark IIs will definitely hold the skies for you in phase A if you need to, and they're way cheaper than bringing in a Tempest. You can bring in both of them for cheaper than a Tempest, which is quite something to think about. The Ulster could be useful, but generally not so much, because your Recon on the ground will be all you need to spot for your Sexton artillery units. So moving into phase B, it's definitely worth having some fighters on your division. So I've got 2 Tempests now coming in at phase B. The extra availability there makes them much more worth having, and I would bring them in phase C, but sometimes you just can't wait, and you need those extra fighters to shoot down units that are harassing you throughout the game. And the other units you can bring in are the Typhoons with the 2 15 HE power bombs. You can also get Typhoon ATs in phase B, but generally I find that having the fighters with the good agility is just way better, and you don't need these units for the airstrikes at this point in the game. Like in phase B, you're going to be focusing on a tank push supported by artillery or whatever else, and spending 180 points or 220 points on a plane just for like 1 strike is just not ideal. Whereas like Tempests, at least they can like pay themselves off quite quickly if they just shoot down an enemy plane. Sure, you could do that with a Typhoon, but they've got bad agility. And for example, this Typhoon only has 550 km/h speed, whereas a Tempest 675 km/h speed with good agility. So it's a big difference, and you definitely see it if you play a lot. Now moving into phase C, I have one of the Typhoon ATs. It's 2-star Typhoon AT, just for trying to pick off enemy vehicles that are harassing me quite heavily. The other thing about the Typhoon AT with the 2-star veterancy is it's very accurate. So it will kill Panthers and King Tigers a lot quicker than normal. So that's the beauty of the Typhoon AT. It hits its target, it can pin down its target very quickly, and even if you don't kill it, you can charge it with your tanks on the ground. And that's where the beauty of the Typhoon AT comes in, especially with the 2-star veterancy, which means it's less affected by AA as well. So there's all that to think about. As for other units that you can choose, I already spoke about the Tempests in phase C for the fighter variants. You can get standard rocket variants of the Tempests as well, but they aren't as accurate. As you can see, 3 accuracy, whereas Typhoon AT has 5 accuracy, which is why they're so much better at killing tanks. And yeah, you can get more availability of Typhoon ATs, but this 2-star veterancy is actually phenomenal. So yeah, that's basically the only reason I'd ever use a Typhoon AT, because of that veterancy. And that's your Guards Armoured. So the division, I would say, is pretty standard. It lacks command across the board, which is why command's quite important to bring in. Like, you can see that I've got command infantry, I've got the command Cromwell, I've got the Dingoes, and then I've got the Shermans. Like, that's a lot of command compared to other divisions. And just making sure that you like utilize command properly in this division makes it actually very strong. It's often perceived to be quite weak in general, because Fireflies and Shermans don't necessarily match up to Panthers on paper, but if you play around tree lines, you can definitely take them out quite easily. The other thing, though, that it's great about the Guards Armoured is they have the Cromwell 6 phase A pressure, which does allow them to be quite aggressive early on, especially if they get a good solid couple kills on some AT guns. They can push through really, really hard. And with the rifle availability, it makes it very hard for the opponents to push back, because they'll just be bumping into rifle squad after rifle squad. They can dig in very, very well. And then on top of that, you've got your Sextons that are going to be constantly harassing enemy AT positions and enemy infantry. So yeah, Lots to think about with the Guards Armoured, but just in general, quite a fun division to play. I quite enjoy playing it. I just find that it's generally not as good as some of the other allied divisions in comparison, but it still holds its own. And again, it requires a certain play style to deal with heavier units that definitely outclass this division. It has a lot of units that are mediocre, and you have to make up with that by using a different strategy. But there you go. That is my updated battlegroup overview for the Guards Armoured. Let me know what you think of my division. Let me know what your own looks like. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.